What if everything you've been told about magic was designed to make you afraid of your own mind? What if the idea that magic is evil was never about morality, but about control? For centuries, we've been taught to see magic as something dark, forbidden, and dangerous. A force tied to demons, corruption, and the fall of man. In the modern world, this belief appears in two dominant forms. On one side, traditional Christianity, especially interpretations rooted in the King James Bible, frames magic as inherently sinful, something that separates humanity from God. On the other, a growing number of people, aware of hidden power structures and elite networks, look at those in control of the world and notice something unsettling, that many of them seem to practice rituals, symbolism, and philosophies that resemble what we call magic. And so, a conclusion forms almost naturally. If those in power use it, then it must be evil. But what if both of these perspectives are missing something deeper? Because beneath the fear, beneath the doctrine, and beneath the modern interpretations of history lies a much older idea. One that suggests magic is not a corruption of nature, but a fundamental part of it. Not something external to humanity, but something woven into the very fabric of consciousness itself. To understand this, we need to step away from everything we've been told and ask a much more uncomfortable question. What is magic, really? If we strip away the fear and the superstition, what remains is something surprisingly simple. Magic, in its oldest definition, is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with the will. In other words, it is the act of turning thought into reality. Every goal you've ever set, every decision you've made, every intention you've followed through on, could be seen as a form of this process, a subtle shaping of the world through focused intention. But ancient traditions didn't stop at physical action. They suggested something far more radical. That the mind itself, under certain conditions, could influence reality directly, not through movement or force, but through consciousness alone. This idea may sound impossible to a modern audience. After all, we've been raised in a worldview dominated by materialism, the belief that only physical matter is real, and that consciousness is merely a byproduct of the brain. In this framework, magic has no place. It is dismissed as illusion, coincidence, or delusion. And yet, this was not always the dominant view. For thousands of years, civilizations across the world operated under a completely different understanding of reality. One in which consciousness was not confined to the body, but existed across multiple layers or planes. A hierarchy of existence, where the physical world was only the densest and most limited expression of something far greater. In this older cosmology, the universe was not a collection of dead matter, but a living system of energy, mind, and intention. And within that system, magic was not an anomaly. It was a natural function. Different states of consciousness, dreaming, trance, deep focus, were seen as gateways, ways of accessing deeper layers of reality, where thought could interact more directly with the structure of the world. Over time, entire systems were developed to explore and refine this ability. Practices, rituals, and disciplines that allowed individuals to train the mind, not just to think, but to shape. This was not chaos. It was not superstition. It was structured, studied, refined over generations. It was a science. And yet, somewhere along the line, that science became forbidden. Why? Why would something so central to human understanding suddenly be labeled as dangerous or even evil? Why would entire institutions rise to condemn it, suppress it, and erase its teachings from the public mind? Because when we look closely, the story doesn't quite add up. If magic were truly just a primitive misunderstanding of the world, why do so many ancient traditions, separated by vast distances and cultures, describe it in such similar ways? Why do they all speak of hidden knowledge, of inner power, of a connection between mind and reality? And perhaps most importantly, why do those in positions of power throughout history seem to have never truly abandoned it? These are not questions that can be answered with simple explanations. They point to something deeper, something buried beneath layers of rewritten history, lost civilizations, and carefully controlled narratives. Because there are clues scattered across time, fragments of a world that once understood these principles not as myth, but as reality. A world where magic was not feared, but mastered. And if that world truly existed, then its disappearance raises an even more unsettling possibility. That what we call history may not be the full story. That something was removed, erased, hidden in plain sight. To uncover it, we have to go further back than religion, further back than recorded history, to a time when magic was not just accepted, but formed the foundation of civilization itself. And as we begin to trace that path, one thing becomes clear. The question is not whether magic is real. The question is, why were we taught that it isn't? Because the deeper we look, the more it begins to feel like we're not discovering something new, but remembering something we were never meant to forget. And to understand how that memory was lost, we must go back to the very beginning, to a world before religion, to a world where magic was everything. Before magic was feared, it was studied. Long before organized religion, before rigid doctrines and moral codes divided the world into good and evil, there existed a different kind of knowledge system, one that did not rely on belief, but on direct experience. It did not ask followers to worship blindly, but to observe, to train, and to understand. This was the age of the ancient mystery schools, across civilizations that, according to modern history, should never have been connected. We find strikingly similar institutions. In ancient Egypt, initiates were trained within temple complexes aligned to celestial patterns. In Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries guided participants through rituals designed to alter perception and reveal deeper truths. In India, advanced yogic systems mapped the layers of consciousness with a precision that still challenges modern neuroscience. And in regions stretching across Europe and into Asia, Druidic traditions preserved knowledge of nature, energy, and the unseen forces that governed reality. Different names, different symbols, but the same underlying principle. Consciousness is the key. These schools did not treat magic as superstition. They treated it as a discipline, a structured path of development. Students were not simply taught ideas. They were trained to transform their perception. Through meditation, ritual, symbolism, and mental focus, they learned to enter altered states of awareness, states in which the boundary between thought and reality began to blur. Because in this older understanding of the world, reality itself was not fixed. It was layered. At the highest level existed what many traditions referred to as the source, the origin of all things. Below it, descending through levels of increasing density, were the spiritual planes. Each plane represented a different mode of existence, a different frequency of reality. And at the very bottom, The physical world. Solid, slow, and limited, but not separate. Everything was connected. What happened in the higher planes influenced what appeared below. Thought, intention, and consciousness were not confined. They moved, interacted, and shaped the structure of reality itself. In this context, magic was not an unnatural act. It was simply the conscious interaction with these layers, and those who mastered it were not seen as dangerous. They were seen as advanced. But this raises an important question. If such knowledge once existed, and if it was as powerful as these traditions suggest, what kind of civilization would emerge from it? Some ancient accounts, often dismissed today as myth, point to a very different kind of world. A world not built solely on physical labor and mechanical tools, but on an understanding of energy, resonance, and consciousness itself. A world that, according to certain traditions, reached its peak in a civilization we now know only by fragments. Atlantis. The name alone carries a sense of mystery. Official history places it firmly in the realm of legend, a symbolic story told by philosophers like Plato. But across cultures, independent of one another, we find echoes of a similar idea. A lost civilization, highly advanced, possessing knowledge far beyond what should have been possible for its time, and then gone. What's often overlooked is not just the claim that Atlantis existed, but what it represented. A society built on the mastery of consciousness. In these accounts, the people of Atlantis were not merely engineers or architects in the conventional sense. They were practitioners of what we would call magic, individuals who understood how to manipulate energy through intention, how to align structures with natural forces, and how to interact with the deeper layers of reality itself. Their technology, if it can even be called that, was not separate from their spirituality. It was an extension of it. But there is another detail, one that appears consistently in these stories. The fall. According to these traditions, Atlantis did not simply disappear due to natural causes. It collapsed from within. A breakdown of balance, a misuse of power. The same knowledge that allowed for incredible advancement also created the potential for destruction. Some accounts describe a division among its people. Those who used this knowledge in harmony with natural law, and those who sought to dominate, to control, to bend reality for personal gain. Over time, this imbalance grew, and eventually it reached a breaking point, a cataclysm. Whether this event was a literal flood, a series of disasters, or something far more complex, the result was the same. The civilization was lost, but not entirely. Because if we follow the threads left behind in ancient traditions, something survived. Fragments of knowledge, small groups of initiates, individuals who carried what remained of this understanding into a new world, not as rulers, but as teachers. And this is where the story begins to shift, because after this collapse, we start to see the emergence of something new. Not entirely different, but changed. The same knowledge, but adapted, structured, organized into systems that could be preserved, transmitted, and, if necessary, hidden. This was the transition from open knowledge to guarded knowledge, from a civilization where magic was integrated into daily life, to a world where it would soon be placed behind symbols, rituals, and layers of secrecy. And as this transition unfolded, one thing became clear. The knowledge itself was not gone. It was being protected. But protected from what? Or perhaps more accurately, protected from whom? Because if Atlantis represents a warning, a demonstration of what happens when power is misused, then the systems that followed were not just about preserving knowledge. They were about controlling it, limiting access, ensuring that only those deemed worthy, or perhaps trustworthy, could reach it. And yet, even within this controlled framework, the knowledge continued to spread across continents, across cultures, leaving behind patterns that even today remain difficult to explain. Because when we look closely, we begin to notice something strange. Civilizations that should have developed independently share the same symbols, the same structures, the same understanding of the cosmos, as if they were all drawing from a single source. A source that, according to some theories, would eventually evolve into something much larger. Not just a network of knowledge, but a global civilization. One that existed far more recently than we've been told. One that may have connected the world in ways we are only beginning to question. A civilization some now refer to as Tartaria. And if that name is unfamiliar, that might not be an accident. Because in the next part, we begin to uncover the evidence of a world that doesn't quite fit into our accepted timeline. A world that may have held the key to everything we've just explored. And a world that, if it truly existed, was erased. If a global civilization once existed, we would expect to find evidence of it. Not just in myths or fragmented legends, but in the physical world itself. In architecture, in cultural patterns, in the subtle fingerprints left behind by a system that once connected distant lands under a shared understanding of reality. And yet, when we look at the official version of history, we're told a very different story. One of isolated civilizations developing independently, slowly, and often without contact. But the deeper we look, the harder that narrative becomes to maintain. Across continents, separated by oceans, cultures that supposedly had no interaction display striking similarities. Massive stone structures aligned with celestial bodies. Intricate geometric designs embedded in temples and cities. Symbolic systems that mirror one another. Circles, spirals, sacred ratios, appearing in places that, according to accepted timelines, should have had no way of sharing knowledge. Is this coincidence? Or is it evidence of something larger? Because when we begin to examine these patterns collectively, they start to resemble not isolated achievements, but fragments of a unified system. A system that may have once spanned the globe. Some researchers have pointed to old maps, documents from just a few centuries ago, that depict vast regions labeled under a single name, Tartaria. In modern history, this term is often dismissed as a vague reference used by European cartographers to describe parts of Central Asia, a placeholder for lands not yet fully understood. But these maps show something more than empty territory. They depict cities, infrastructure, organized regions. In some cases, entire networks of settlements stretching across areas that today are considered remote or underdeveloped. And then there is the architecture. From Europe to Asia, from the Americas to parts of the Middle East, we find structures that share an uncanny resemblance. Grand buildings with domes, arches, and intricate facades. Cathedrals and civic structures that appear far more advanced than what the surrounding societies should have been capable of producing at the time they are said to have been built. In many cases, the official explanation is simple. These were constructed by emerging nations, using the tools and knowledge available at the time. But when we look closer, questions begin to emerge. How were these massive structures built so quickly? Often in regions that lacked the infrastructure to support such projects. Why do many of them appear fully formed in historical records, with little evidence of gradual development? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why do so many of these buildings share the same design principles, as if they were part of a standardized system? It's almost as if they were inherited. as if they were already there and then repurposed. This idea becomes even more intriguing when we consider the cultural parallels found across the world. Myths of giants, often described with similar features, such as unusual height or distinct physical traits, appear in the folklore of Native American tribes, European legends, and even ancient Asian texts. Stories of advanced beings who brought knowledge, who built cities, who taught humanity the foundations of civilization. Different names, different interpretations, but the same underlying theme. Could these stories be symbolic? Exaggerations passed down through generations? Or are they distorted memories of something real? Because when we align these myths with the architectural evidence and with the anomalies in historical records, a different picture begins to form. One that suggests the existence of a civilization far more advanced than we've been told. Not ancient in the distant sense, but relatively recent. A society that may have thrived within the last several hundred years. One that possessed not only architectural and engineering knowledge, but a deeper understanding of energy, consciousness, and the principles we previously associated with magic. A civilization that connected the world. This is what some refer to as Tartaria, not as a single nation or culture in the traditional sense, but as a global system, a network of knowledge and infrastructure that spanned continents. A continuation, perhaps, of the post-Atlantean traditions carried forward by those who survived the earlier cataclysm. And if this is true, then the implications are staggering. Because it would mean that the foundations of our current world, the cities, the technologies, even the spiritual systems we take for granted, may not have originated where we think they did. They may have been inherited, but if such a system existed, why is it not taught? Why is it not acknowledged in mainstream history? Why do we find only fragments, scattered clues, hints that something doesn't quite fit? To answer that, we need to look not just at what remains, but at what changed. Because if Tartaria, or whatever this civilization truly was, represented a unified system of knowledge, then its disappearance would not have been a simple event. It would have required a shift, a transformation, something that disrupted not just the physical structures, but the transmission of knowledge itself. Some accounts suggest that this shift was not gradual, but sudden, a cataclysmic event that altered the course of history. Not the same event that destroyed Atlantis, but something more recent, something that occurred within the last few hundred years. An event that left cities abandoned, populations displaced, and systems of knowledge fractured. And in the aftermath, a vacuum, one that would soon be filled. Because as this older system faded, a new structure began to emerge. One that would redefine how knowledge was preserved, who had access to it, and how it would be interpreted. A structure built not on direct experience, but on authority. On centralized control, on narratives that could be shaped, adjusted, and, if necessary, rewritten. And this is where the story begins to take a darker turn. Because if knowledge of consciousness, of magic, of the true nature of reality was once widespread, then its disappearance was not just a loss, it was a removal. And removals rarely happen by accident. In the next part, we begin to examine the forces that may have been responsible, the institutions that rose in the wake of this collapse, and the methods they used to reshape history itself. Because the deeper we dig, the more it begins to feel like this was not just the fall of a civilization, but the beginning of a new system. One designed to ensure that what came before would never be remembered. If a civilization was erased, it would not be enough to destroy its cities. You would have to destroy its memory. Because buildings can be repurposed, artifacts can be buried, entire regions can be renamed. But as long as people remember what something was, the truth remains alive. And so, if there truly was a system, a global network of knowledge, architecture, and spiritual understanding, then its removal would require something far more deliberate than simple collapse. It would require control over history itself. And this is where we begin to see a pattern. Following the period in which this supposed global civilization disappears from the record, new institutions rise to prominence. Not gradually, but with a level of organization and influence that seems disproportionate. Chief among them is the expansion of the Roman Church and its later developments, structures that not only shaped religious belief, but also dictated what was recorded, what was preserved, and what was considered truth. This is not speculation. Throughout history, we see repeated instances where knowledge systems that existed outside of centralized authority were suppressed. Mystery schools, once the custodians of ancient practices, were systematically dismantled. Their teachings labeled as heretical, their practitioners persecuted, their texts destroyed or absorbed into sanctioned doctrine. Why? Because these systems represented something dangerous, not in the sense of chaos, but in the sense of independence. They taught individuals how to access knowledge directly, how to explore consciousness without intermediaries, how to understand reality not through belief, but through experience. And in doing so, they remove the need for centralized authority. That kind of knowledge cannot coexist with control. And so it was redefined. What was once considered sacred science became forbidden practice. What was once a path to understanding became a symbol of corruption. The word magic itself began to shift in meaning, not as a neutral or advanced discipline, but as something dark, something deceptive, something aligned with forces opposed to the divine. But language alone was not enough. To truly reshape perception, you have to reshape the narrative. And this is where the rewriting of history becomes critical. Across various historical accounts, we find references to the deliberate alteration of timelines, the renaming of cultures, and the consolidation of disparate traditions into unified frameworks. Complex, localized knowledge systems were absorbed into broader religious structures. Stories were edited. Context was removed. And over time, the original meanings became obscured. Consider this. If you take a system of knowledge that teaches individuals how to access higher states of consciousness, and you embed fragments of it into a religious text, while simultaneously removing the practical methods required to experience it, you create something very different. You create belief without understanding. You preserve the symbols, but strip away the function. And perhaps most importantly, you redirect the source of power. Instead of the individual accessing truth directly, they are now told that truth must come from an external authority, from a church, from a doctrine, from an institution that stands between them and whatever lies beyond. This shift is subtle, but profound. It transforms a system of self-discovery into a system of dependence. And when we look in the historical expansion of religious institutions, we begin to see how effective this transformation was. Entire regions were brought under unified belief systems. Local traditions were replaced. Practices that once existed openly were driven underground, surviving only in fragments, hidden within secret societies, encoded in symbolism, or preserved in obscure texts. The mystery schools did not disappear completely. They adapted. Operating in secrecy, they continued to pass on what remained of the older knowledge. But now, access was limited. Initiation was required, and the teachings themselves became layered, symbolic, often difficult to interpret without guidance. Why such secrecy? Because openly sharing this knowledge had become dangerous, not just socially, but politically. Because at this point in history, power was no longer just about land or resources. It was about perception. Control what people believe, and you control how they see the world. Control how they see the world, and you control what they think is possible. And if people no longer believe that they have the ability to influence reality through their own consciousness, then that ability, whether real or not, becomes irrelevant. It fades, not because it was taken away, but because it was forgotten. And this brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of this entire narrative: the idea that even the most sacred texts, the ones considered the foundation of modern belief systems, may not be what they appear to be. Because if knowledge was being consolidated, edited, and repurposed, then it is not unreasonable to ask whether those same processes were applied to the texts that would come to define spiritual understanding for millions of people. What if the stories remained, but their meanings were altered? What if the language was preserved, but its origins were obscured? What if the very structure of these texts was designed not just to teach, but to guide perception in a specific direction? These are not easy questions. They challenge deeply held beliefs. They force us to reconsider the foundations of what we've been taught, and they open the door to possibilities that many would rather not explore. But when we begin to examine certain inconsistencies, repetitions that seem unnatural, linguistic patterns that don't quite align, historical timelines that raise more questions than answers, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that something has been adjusted, not necessarily fabricated entirely, but modified, refined, shaped. And if that is the case, then we are not just dealing with a loss of knowledge. We are dealing with a transformation of it, a redirection, one that may have taken the fragments of an older, more direct understanding of reality and repackaged them into a form that could be controlled, distributed, and interpreted within a specific framework. A framework that would define what is acceptable and what is not, what is sacred and what is forbidden, what is truth and what is labeled as illusion. And within that framework, magic had to be placed on the outside. Not because it was inherently evil, but because it represented something that could not be easily controlled. Something that pointed back to a time when individuals did not need permission to seek truth. A time when the connection between consciousness and reality was not mediated, but direct. And if even a fraction of that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was changed? And how deep does that change go? Because in the next part, we begin to examine one of the boldest claims of all, that the very text used to condemn magic may have once been rooted in it. If the system was rewritten, then the truth would not disappear. It would be hidden. Not removed entirely, but embedded. Layered beneath symbols, encoded in language, preserved just enough to survive, but altered enough to mislead. Because the most effective way to control knowledge is not to destroy it, but to reshape how it is understood. And nowhere does this possibility become more unsettling than when we turn our attention to one of the most influential texts in human history, the Bible. For many, it is the foundation of faith, a sacred record of divine truth, a guide to morality, spirituality, and the nature of existence itself. But what if the version we know today is not the original expression of that knowledge? What if it is an adaptation, a carefully edited compilation of older teachings, restructured, translated, and modified over time to serve a different purpose? This is not a new idea. Scholars and critics have long pointed out inconsistencies within the text, passages that repeat almost identically across different accounts, linguistic anomalies that suggest multiple layers of authorship, historical references that do not always align with the accepted timeline. But beyond these academic observations lies a more provocative claim, that the origins of the Bible may trace back to a much older system of knowledge, one connected not to the familiar geography of the Middle East, but to traditions rooted in ancient European, and specifically Irish, spiritual systems. At first, this idea seems implausible, and yet, when we begin to examine the details, certain patterns emerge. Consider the structure of the Gospels. The accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often referred to as the Synoptic Gospels because of their similarities. In many cases, they describe events using nearly identical phrasing. Entire sentences appear to be repeated, word for word, across different texts. From a conventional perspective, this is explained as shared sources or collaborative authorship. But if we step back, another possibility appears, that these texts were not independently written accounts, but compiled from an earlier source, a source that was copied, translated, and adjusted, resulting in the unusual uniformity we see today. This raises a question. What was that source? Some theories suggest that the original material may have been written in a different language entirely, one that predates the commonly accepted origins of the text. Linguistic traces, subtle but persistent, point toward structures and meanings that align more closely with older Celtic or Gaelic traditions than with the later interpretations we are familiar with. Words that appear Hebrew on the surface, revealing deeper layers of meaning when examined through a different linguistic lens. Symbols that seem straightforward, taking on entirely new interpretations when placed within the context of earlier cosmologies. Even names, figures we recognize instantly, may carry echoes of older archetypes, their origins obscured through translation and reinterpretation. If this is true, then the Bible is not a singular creation. It is a composite, a tapestry woven from older threads. And like any tapestry, what we see on the surface is only part of the story, because beneath it, the original pattern may still exist, hidden, distorted, waiting to be recognized. But why would such a transformation take place? Why take an existing body of knowledge and reshape it? The answer may lie in the shift we explored earlier, the transition from direct experience to mediated belief. If the original teachings were rooted in practices that allowed individuals to access higher states of consciousness, to engage with what we might call magic, then preserving those teachings in their original form would pose a challenge to any centralized authority, because it would empower the individual, and empowerment is difficult to control. But if those same teachings were preserved in symbolic form, stripped of their practical application, reframed within a narrative that emphasizes faith over experience, they could still be maintained without granting access to their full potential. In this scenario, the text becomes a container, a vessel that holds fragments of the original knowledge, while guiding interpretation in a specific direction. A direction that aligns with structure, hierarchy, and control. This does not mean the text is without value. Far from it. It may still contain profound truths, insights into the nature of existence, the structure of consciousness, the path toward understanding. But those truths may be layered, requiring interpretation beyond the surface. And this is where the connection to magic becomes impossible to ignore. Because if the original system was based on the idea that consciousness can influence reality, that intention, when properly directed, can shape the world, then many of the practices we see within organized religion begin to take on a different meaning. Prayer, ritual, repetition, focus. These are not just acts of devotion. They are structured methods of directing thought, of aligning intention, of engaging with the same principles that ancient traditions described as magic. But within the current framework, they are presented differently. Not as tools of personal mastery, but as acts of submission, requests made to an external force, hope placed outside the self. The mechanism remains, but the direction changes, and with that change comes a shift in power. Because if individuals believe that the source of change lies outside of them, rather than within, then the need for intermediaries becomes essential. Institutions become necessary. Authority becomes justified. And the original understanding that the connection between consciousness and reality is direct begins to fade, replaced by something safer, something more manageable, but perhaps not entirely complete. Because even within this altered framework, traces remain. Clues embedded in language, patterns that repeat across cultures, moments where the surface narrative cracks, just enough to reveal something deeper, something older, something that does not quite fit within the boundaries we've been given. And as we begin to notice these patterns, to connect these threads, the picture becomes clearer. Not fully revealed, but unmistakably different from what we were taught. Because if the Bible, as we know it, is an adaptation, then the system it replaced must have been something else entirely, something more direct, more experiential, more aligned with the idea that the human mind is not separate from reality, but a participant in it. And if that is the case, then the question we started with begins to take on a new meaning. Not whether magic is evil, but whether it was ever meant to be forbidden at all. Because in the next part, we move beyond theory and begin to examine the systems that replaced it, the mechanisms that ensured this older knowledge would not return, and the subtle ways in which its fragments still persist. If the original system was transformed, then what replaced it had to be equally powerful. Not in the sense of truth, but in the sense of influence. Because once knowledge shifts from direct experience to structured belief, the system that carries that belief becomes the new authority. And authority, once established, does not simply preserve information, it shapes it. It decides what is emphasized, what is hidden, and what is reinterpreted to fit a larger narrative. By the early modern period, this transformation appears to reach a critical stage. One of the most significant moments in this process is the emergence of the English translation of the Bible under King James I. Officially, it is presented as a unifying effort, a way to standardize religious text for a growing population. A translation meant to bring clarity, consistency, and accessibility. But when we examine the context more closely, it becomes clear that this was not just a translation. It was a consolidation, a refinement of a system that had already undergone layers of modification. And within that process, one figure often appears in the background, quietly influential, yet rarely acknowledged in mainstream narratives. Francis Bacon. Bacon is widely known as a philosopher, a pioneer of the scientific method, and a key figure in the intellectual transformation of Europe. But beyond his public identity, there are persistent suggestions, controversial, yet difficult to dismiss entirely, that he played a deeper role in shaping the texts and ideas that would define the modern world. Not as a creator of entirely new knowledge, but as an editor, a compiler. Someone who understood both the old systems and the emerging structures of control, and who sought to bridge them. In this context, the King James Bible becomes more than a religious document. It becomes a tool, a way of preserving certain elements of older knowledge, symbolism, archetypes, narratives, while embedding them within a framework that redirects their meaning. A framework that emphasizes faith, obedience, and external authority over personal exploration and inner development. And when we look at Bacon's own work, we begin to see echoes of this approach. In his writings, he describes visions of a future society, structured, organized, guided by scientific principles. A world in which knowledge is centralized, controlled, and applied in a way that prevents the chaos of earlier ages. A world that, in some interpretations, appears to be a response to the very problems that may have led to the collapse of previous civilizations. A new Atlantis, not a restoration of the old system, but a replacement. And if we consider this idea carefully, a pattern begins to emerge. The original system, rooted in direct experience, in the mastery of consciousness, in what we've called magic, allowed for immense potential. But it also carried risk, the possibility of imbalance, of misuse, of individuals accessing power without restraint. So the solution was not to eliminate the knowledge entirely, but to contain it, to reshape it into a form that could be managed. This is where the transformation becomes subtle. Instead of teaching individuals how to access higher states of consciousness directly, the system begins to emphasize belief. Instead of encouraging the development of inner faculties, it promotes adherence to external doctrine. Instead of viewing the individual as a participant in reality, it positions them as an observer, dependent on forces beyond their control. And yet, the structure remains. The rituals are still there. Prayer, repetition, symbolic gestures, communal ceremonies, these are not random practices. They are organized methods of focusing attention, of directing thought, of aligning groups of individuals toward a shared intention. In another context, they might be recognized as forms of magic. But within this system, they are redefined. They are no longer tools of personal development, but acts of devotion. And this distinction is critical, because it changes the direction of the process. Instead of the individual shaping reality, the individual now seeks change from an external source. The mechanism is the same, but the perceived origin of power shifts, and with that shift comes control. Because if people believe that their ability to influence reality is limited, that it requires permission, that it must be mediated through an institution, then the institution becomes indispensable. It becomes the gateway, the authority, the interpreter of truth. But what happens to the knowledge that doesn't fit within this framework? It doesn't disappear. It moves underground. Throughout history, we see the emergence of groups that operate outside the official system. Societies that preserve fragments of older teachings, symbols that appear in unexpected places, traditions that hint at a deeper understanding of consciousness, energy, and the structure of reality. Some of these groups are viewed with suspicion, others with fascination. Many are misunderstood, but they all share one common trait. They exist in the margins, not fully visible, but not entirely hidden. And this creates a paradox. Because while the official narrative presents magic as forbidden, dangerous, or non-existent, elements of it continue to appear in the practices of those who hold influence. Rituals, symbols, patterns of behavior that mirror the very systems that were supposedly erased. This contradiction is difficult to ignore. If magic is truly evil, why does it persist in the structures of power? If it is meaningless, why is it preserved at all? These questions do not have simple answers, but they point to something deeper, something that suggests the story we've been told is incomplete. Because when we step back and look at the larger picture, we begin to see two parallel systems, one visible, structured, defined by doctrine and authority, and another, less obvious, fragmented, preserved in symbols, in practices, in the quiet transmission of knowledge across generations. The first tells us what to believe. The second invites us to explore. And somewhere between them lies the truth. Because if the original system was not destroyed, but transformed, then its essence still exists. Not in its original form, but in pieces, waiting to be recognized. And as we move forward, the question becomes less about what was taken and more about what remains, because in the next part, we begin to look beyond the systems themselves and ask a more direct question. What is magic, really? Not as it has been defined by fear, not as it has been shaped by doctrine, but as it exists at its core. Because once we understand that, everything else begins to change. So what is magic? When we remove everything that has been layered on top of it. Not the fear, not the symbolism, not the distortions created by centuries of reinterpretation, but the core idea itself. The thing that existed before it was labeled, categorized, and ultimately condemned. At its most fundamental level, magic is not an object, a ritual, or even a belief system. It is a process rooted in consciousness. If we return to the oldest definitions, stripped of cultural bias, magic is described as the ability to cause change in accordance with the will, not through physical force alone, but through the alignment of thought, intention, and awareness. This may sound abstract at first, but when we examine our daily lives, the concept becomes surprisingly familiar. Every action begins with a thought. Every decision is shaped by intention. Every outcome is, in some way, influenced by the focus we bring to it. In this sense, we are already participating in this process, constantly, unconsciously, and without questioning it. The difference between ordinary experience and what ancient traditions called magic is not the existence of the process, but the awareness of it. Magic in this context is simply the conscious application of something that is already happening. And this is where the idea becomes more complex. Because according to older systems of knowledge, the mind is not limited to passive observation. It is not just reacting to reality. It is interacting with it, influencing it, shaping it in ways that are subtle but real. This does not mean that thought alone can instantly alter the physical world in dramatic ways. That is a modern exaggeration, a distortion often seen in popular interpretations of spirituality. Instead, the process is more nuanced. It involves states of consciousness, focus, alignment. The ability to direct attention with precision and consistency, and when these elements are combined, they begin to affect not just perception, but experience itself. Ancient traditions understood this deeply. They developed systems designed to train the mind, to move beyond habitual thinking and into states where intention could be applied more effectively. Meditation, visualization, ritual, symbolic language, these were not arbitrary practices. They were tools, methods of refining consciousness. And yet, in the modern world, these practices are often misunderstood. They are either dismissed as superstition or repackaged into simplified, commercialized ideas that lack depth. Concepts like the law of attraction reduce complex systems into slogans. Rituals become aesthetic rather than functional, and the original purpose, the development of awareness, is often lost. At the same time, there are other interpretations that take the opposite extreme. Systems that associate magic exclusively with darkness, with control, manipulation, and harm. Practices that isolate certain aspects of the original knowledge and amplify them, removing balance and context. But both of these extremes miss the point, because magic, as described in its original form, is neutral. It is not inherently good or evil. It is a tool, and like any tool, its impact depends on how it is used. This is perhaps the most important distinction. Because when we label something as inherently evil, we remove the responsibility from the individual. We create a separation, a clear boundary between what is acceptable and what is not. But in doing so, we also limit understanding. We stop asking deeper questions. We stop exploring nuance, and we accept the definition without examining its origin. But if we approach this differently, If we consider the possibility that magic is simply a natural function of consciousness, then the conversation changes. It becomes less about fear and more about awareness. Because if this process exists, then it is already part of us. Not something we can avoid, not something we can eliminate, but something we can either understand or ignore. And when we look at existing systems of belief, we begin to see how this process is still present, just under different names. Prayer, for example. At its surface, it is an act of communication, a request directed toward a higher power. But when we examine the structure of prayer, we see familiar elements: focused intention, repetition, emotional alignment, visualization of desired outcomes. These are not random components. They are the same principles found in older practices of conscious influence. The difference lies in interpretation. In one system, the individual is seen as the source of alignment, a participant in the process. In the other, the individual is positioned as separate, reliant on an external force to create change. But the mechanism itself remains. And this is where the idea becomes difficult to ignore. Because if the structure of magic still exists within modern practices, if it has not disappeared, but simply been reframed, then the question is no longer whether magic is real. The question is why it was redefined, why it was separated from its original context, why it was associated so strongly with fear. Because if something is truly meaningless, it does not need to be suppressed. It fades on its own. But if something persists, if it continues to appear across cultures, across time, across systems, then its presence suggests significance. And significance often attracts control. This brings us back to the paradox we've been circling. Magic is presented as forbidden, yet its structure is embedded in everyday practices. It is dismissed as illusion, yet its principles appear in systems that shape belief and behavior. It is associated with darkness, yet its foundations are rooted in awareness and intention. So which version is true? Perhaps all of them, or perhaps none. Because the deeper we look, the more it becomes clear that what we are dealing with is not a single definition, but a fragmented understanding. Pieces of a larger system, separated, reinterpreted, and distributed across different frameworks, each one holding part of the picture, but none of them complete. And if that is the case, then the task is not to accept or reject magic as a concept, but to understand it, to look beyond the labels, to examine the process itself. Because once we do, the question of whether it is evil begins to dissolve, replaced by something more fundamental. What is the nature of consciousness, and what role does it play in the reality we experience? Because in the final part, we step back from the details and consider what all of this means, not just for history, but for us. Because if even a fraction of this is true, then the implications go far beyond theory. They point to something much closer, something immediate, something that has been there all along, waiting to be seen. We began with a question that seemed simple. Is magic evil? But as we followed the trail through ancient mystery schools, lost civilizations, fragmented histories, and rewritten systems of belief, that question began to change. It became less about morality and more about memory, less about fear and more about understanding. Because what we uncovered was not a clear answer, but a pattern. A pattern that suggests something was not merely forgotten, but redefined. If magic, in its original form, was a natural extension of consciousness, a way of interacting with reality through intention, awareness, and alignment, then labeling it as evil would not eliminate it. It would only change how it is perceived, and perception shapes behavior. If people believe that something is dangerous, they avoid it. If they believe it is forbidden, they distance themselves from it, and over time that distance becomes disconnection. Not because the thing itself has changed, but because the relationship to it has. This is where the implications become difficult to ignore. Because if the connection between consciousness and reality is real, if even a small part of what ancient traditions described holds truth, then the loss of that understanding is not just philosophical. It is practical. It affects how we see ourselves, how we approach the world, how we interpret the boundaries of what is possible, and perhaps most importantly, how much of our own potential we choose to explore. But why would such a shift occur? Why would a system that emphasizes direct experience, personal development, and inner awareness be replaced by one that prioritizes belief, structure, and external authority? There are many possible answers. Some suggest it was necessary, that earlier civilizations, having access to powerful knowledge, misused it, leading to imbalance, collapse, and the need for a more controlled system. In this view, the transformation was not malicious, but protective, a way of preventing history from repeating itself. Others see it differently. They point to the consolidation of power, the suppression of alternative knowledge systems, the rewriting of history, and the consistent pattern of centralization. They argue that the shift was not about protection, but about control. That by redefining the source of power, moving it from the individual to the institution, those in authority could maintain influence over not just actions, but perception itself. Both perspectives may hold elements of truth, because history is rarely defined by a single narrative. It is shaped by layers, by decisions, intentions, and consequences that unfold over time. And somewhere within those layers, the original understanding may still exist, not in its complete form, but in fragments, in practices that persist across cultures, in symbols that repeat in unexpected places, in moments of awareness, brief, subtle, often overlooked, where the boundary between thought and experience becomes less defined. Moments where intuition feels precise, where focus alters perception, where the inner world and the outer world seem connected. These moments are easy to dismiss, to rationalize, to explain away, but they are also consistent, and consistency over time suggests pattern, and pattern suggests meaning. So perhaps the question is not whether magic is real, or whether it is good or evil. Perhaps the question is, what happens when we begin to pay attention? Not in the sense of adopting new beliefs, but in the sense of observing, noticing how thought influences action, how attention shapes experience, how the way we interpret reality affects the way we interact with it. Because if magic, at its core, is simply the conscious engagement with these processes, then it is not something separate from us. It is something we are already part of, whether we recognize it or not. And that recognition does not require rituals, symbols, or systems. It begins with awareness, with the willingness to question assumptions, to look beyond the surface of what we've been told, to consider that the boundaries we perceive may not be as fixed as they seem. This does not mean abandoning existing beliefs. It does not mean accepting every alternative theory. It simply means remaining open, curious, willing to explore. Because the history we've examined is not just about the past, it is about the present, about how we understand ourselves right now. And if even a fraction of this perspective is accurate, then the implications are not distant or abstract. They are immediate. They suggest that the connection between mind and reality is not something reserved for ancient civilizations or hidden traditions. It is something that exists here, now, in every thought, in every decision, in every moment of attention. And that realization is not something that can be given. It cannot be taught in the traditional sense. It has to be experienced, recognized, discovered. Because the truth, whatever it may be, does not need to be imposed. It reveals itself when we begin to look. So as we come to the end of this investigation, we are left not with a final answer, but with a different kind of question. Not is magic evil, But what is it that we've been taught to ignore? And perhaps more importantly, what might we discover if we choose to look again? Because this journey does not end here. There are more patterns to uncover, more connections to explore, more questions that challenge what we think we know. And if you want to continue that journey, if you're willing to explore the hidden layers of history, consciousness, and the world around us, then stay with us. Subscribe and become part of this investigation. Because the deeper we go, the more it becomes clear. This is not just about the past. It's about understanding the reality we are living in right now. And that may be the greatest mystery of all.